Hello, I'm Lise Falskow, CEO of the Alaska World Affairs Council, an organization dedicated to bringing issues around the world to Alaska. We're a nonpartisan, non-political educational organization, and it is my pleasure to bring to you today Dr. Margo Thorning. Welcome, Dr. Thorning. Leading up to our elections, our national office has identified 6 key issues that should be discussed and talked about during these elections that are of great importance to our national security: Afghanistan, China, and one of those is U.S. energy policy. So my question to you today is, why is that an important issue, and why is that a global issue?
Well, energy policy is very important to a country's security and well-being because low-cost energy helps promote economic and job growth. And in fact, here in the U.S., the development of oil and gas resources in states like Montana, North Dakota, Wyoming, Oklahoma, and Texas has accounted for their very strong growth in personal income since the end of the recession in 2009. In addition, U.S. oil production in the lower 48 has gone up very sharply, along with natural gas production. That's producing a real bonanza for the manufacturing industry, the low-cost natural gas. It's also increased jobs and economic activity. So energy development is very important for a country's well-being.
Do you see an energy policy in the future or a discussion of those with developments in North Dakota like you mentioned?
Well, we're hoping that we will be able to continue to get access to resources that currently have been off limits. And if we do, according to a new Wood-Mackenzie study, U.S. Economic growth would be accelerated. Energy production, is associated with jobs not just in the oil and gas industry, but steel manufacturers, information technology, engineers, scientists. So we're hoping that with continued access to reserves and perhaps some more rational approach by the Environmental Protection Agency in terms of weighing the costs and the benefits of alternative approaches to energy development, we're hoping to be able to take advantage of the U.S. vast reserves and continue to keep energy costs relatively low.
Okay, so if the next president were to say, Dr. Thorning, we'd love to have you on the Energy Commission, we're going to establish a policy, what are some key things you would want in that policy?
I would want to continue to expand access to reserves offshore and onshore. Much of our reserves are currently off limits. And the study by Wood-Mackenzie that I mentioned earlier shows that U.S. job growth would be substantially greater, federal tax receipts would be substantially greater, and energy prices would be relatively more favorable if we could continue to develop these resources. We need environmental protection, but we need to use cost-benefit analysis as permits are evaluated and as proposals are put forward. And we need to be careful as we address climate change that we don't put in place policies that may make no sense globally. For example, regulating greenhouse gas emissions under the Clean Air Act is a policy of regulating by fiat, and it's unknown what the impact may be on utilities and on commercial industry as well as manufacturing. So when you think of the climate change issue, it's a global issue and one that requires a global solution. So requiring U.S. firms to reduce GHGs through the Clean Air Act is not an efficient way of dealing with the potential changes in the climate that may occur.
So would global greenhouse gas policy be one of your key components to an energy policy?
It would not be the top priority. The top priority, I think, should be to continue to keep energy prices relatively stable. For example, looking at the growth in GDP, each 1% increase in the U.S. gross domestic product is accompanied by a 0.2% increase in energy use. If we make energy more expensive, it's going to slow our GDP growth, which is averaging less than 2% a year right now. So we need to focus on keeping energy relatively low cost and affordable for not only business but consumers and the commercial sector.
Well, so we're seeing that the U.S. is now in a position where we could potentially be a net exporter of energy.
Yes.
Do you think that this is a good idea?
I think it should, natural gas, for example, LNG, should be treated no differently from any other commodity. There should not be, in my view, restrictions on the ability of a company to export a product like liquefied natural gas. It's would be in violation of the World Trade Organization agreements. It would make it harder for us to attack China for restricting the exportation of rare earths, for example. So I think the market should solve the decision about how much LNG should be exported and when.
Okay, so you mentioned the McKinsey information, and I took a peek at some of your slides that you'll be showing later on today. Now, these slides are going to be posted along with this video and on our websites. And if someone were to go and look at those slides, what are one or two key slides that you'd want them to see and take notice?
Well, because energy use is so critical to U.S. economic growth, we need to think about how we tax producers of energy. The latest data I've looked at, there was a new study from Harvard and World Bank that looked at how corporate tax rates impact new investment. The study looked at 85 countries, developing, in between, 85 different countries, and came to the conclusion that each 10 percentage point increase in the corporate tax rate reduced investment as a percent of GDP by 2 percentage points. And investment is important because it's what enables the economy to grow, the economic pie to expand, real wages to rise. So I think people should think about how they tax energy producers, because the data show the higher the tax, the less investment in general, and in particular here in Alaska, if you look at the data, the tax rate increased since 2007, and you look at the plummeting oil production in this state, it seems pretty clear that if you tax something more, you're going to get less of it.
Okay, this is a very important topic for our state. So if you were a company or running a company here in Alaska and looking at energy production or investment options and looking at our current structure, would you pass or would you invest more in Alaska?
Well, given the change in the tax burden since 2007 when ACES was put in place, and looking at real inflation-adjusted capital expenditures in the North Slope in Alaska, it seems pretty clear that companies here have some concerns about continuing to invest in the state because of the tax policy. Oil and gas companies can go anywhere in the lower 48 and invest there. They can go anywhere in the world and invest. So I think a company would be wise to look at its options and decide whether, in fact, it makes sense to continue to try to develop new resources here. And judging by the sharp decline in production in the last 10 years or so, it seems pretty clear that not enough investments being made, perhaps in response to the harsh climate here, the change in the tax law, and other factors that are making this a less attractive place to invest.
Okay, so taxing, this is a really also relevant question for our state, and we're looking at different taxing options. And as an economist and a tax specialist, there are so many different ways you can tax, not just increasing or decreasing the rates, but deductions and capital incentives. What are some options that Alaska should be considering when looking at tax policies on energy companies?
Well, I would look at the tax burden on companies operating in Alaska, and people can see if they look at my slides, the burden on a company for each barrel of oil that they produce is substantially higher here than in the lower 48, for example. And of course, as we know, oil production in the lower 48 is expanding very rapidly in states like Montana, North Dakota, Texas, Oklahoma. So I would take a look at what other states are doing who are experiencing and enjoying higher growth in production, in contrast to Alaska's fall in production. I would also take a look at broadening the tax base in this state. When I looked at the Department of Revenue budget data, I saw that 90% of the revenues that come in from activities here in Alaska are from the oil and gas industry. To me, that's placing all your eggs in one basket. And of course, if oil prices were to decline, that's going to hurt revenues. I'm not aware of any other state in the U.S. that is so dependent on tax receipts from one industry. So I think it's a little bit dangerous to be so dependent. I would consider broadening the tax base, perhaps with a small general sales tax or a small income tax, so that not all the state's revenue eggs are in that one oil and gas basket.
Now, for taxes, what are some other things that could be considered for tax incentives to increase investment?
Well, of course, incentives that reduce the cost of capital, like quick write-off, bonus depreciation, or investment tax credits, do help reduce the cost of capital. But still, right now, Alaska doesn't compare very favorably. Even though there are some incentives for new production, the tax rate on a barrel of oil is substantially higher than in other states and substantially higher than other countries for the most part. So I think it would be better to figure out a way to lower the tax rate on the revenue and consider broadening the tax base. For example, if Alaska switched to a tax on consumption, which a sales tax is, that would tend to encourage more saving because it's now more costly to spend. Most states, individuals are simply not saving enough, especially for their retirement. So if we could change the incentives through consumption taxes, Alaska's wealth would probably grow faster.
Now, you've testified in front of Senate committees in Canada and the U.S., and have you noticed any differences in either country's willingness to listen to these ideas of changing policies?
It's hard to say. Economists probably aren't the most listened to people. But I have seen in Canada, for example, good policies toward fiscal, keeping their fiscal house in order, not giving individuals incentives for some of the expenditures that we have here. For example, in Canada, there's no deduction for home mortgage interest, and Canada has the same rate of home ownership that we do here in the U.S., where mortgage interest is fully deductible for most people. So I believe looking to your southern neighbors might be, you might pick up some good tips about the tax base and how to have a broader base for tax receipts.
So as an energy economist, do you think that we fare better by taxing more on less production or taxing less on more production?
Well, as I said, for most commodities, the more you tax it, the less people are going to want to buy it and the less producers are going to produce it. So I think it would be good to consider taxing less and see if you get more. Alaskan oil production has dropped very dramatically since the 80s. You're down to about 450,000 barrels a day, and that's, I would think, alarming. So since what you're doing here is not working very well, you might want to consider changing the tax structure and see if you get more production, which is critical to your tax base here.
So as a final question to wrap this all up, as an economist, what is your recommendation for Alaska?
I would consider lowering the rate that ACES is imposed and see if after 3 or 4 years you're not seeing more development of new fields, more exploration and production, more job growth. And it can always be revisited after a few years, but it seems pretty clear that companies are doing most of their investment outside Alaska because of the more favorable tax regimes. Taxes do matter. They're not the be-all and end-all, but they do matter, and they do influence where companies decide to put their shareholder resources.
Now, I said that was the last question, but of course I have so many more, and so I hope people come to the program on Friday Alaska World Affairs Council programs are held twice a month at the Hilton Hotel, and you can see experts like Dr. Thorning speak about energies and issues that are important around the world. Thank you.